What does this airplane, and even this airplane all have in common? Let's find out on Celebrating Aviation with Mike Mashad. By request. And special thanks to my young friend Robbie Bagdasarian for this wonderful idea for a presentation on my YouTube channel. As you might have guessed, these three airplanes are referred to as spy planes. And as scintillating as that title may be, it's all about the gathering of information, specifically ISR. That stands for intelligence, surveillance, and reconnaissance. Now, out of respect for YouTube protocol and national security, I'm not going to delve into great detail on how this happens or why this happens, but I can tell you where this happens. In general, it's referred to as denied territory. As mentioned, I want to be very respectful of YouTube protocol. There's a lot of information about this activity in the news today, but I do want to say full disclosure that all of the information that you're about to see in this presentation is readily available in public media. Having said that, let's dive in. We're going to look at the history of ISR aircraft and all the different types that were used in the 20th century and even up to today. So let's go back, well, even further than this. No, even further than that. Well, now we're in World War I, observation balloons, sitting ducks for airplanes, and again, the first use of aerial recon. But believe it or not, we're going to go further back than this. We're going back to the Civil War. The first use of balloons for military observation was actually in France by the French Aerostatic Corps at the Battle of Fleurus in 1794. In the United States, Professor Thaddeus Lowe, seen here in the balloon's basket in 1861, became chief aeronaut for the first operational U.S. military aviation unit, the Union Army Balloon Corps, which served during the Civil War. As a side note, Lowe's granddaughter, Florence Lowe Barnes, who was born in 1901, became a pioneering aviator in her own right. Better known as Poncho, she was a famed air racing pilot, founder of the movie Stunt Pilots Union, and owner of the fabled Happy Bottom Riding Club at Muroc, California, later Edwards Air Force Base. She is seen here in the early 1950s, flanked by test pilots Pete Everest, Chuck Yeager, and Bud Anderson, a proud legacy. In World War II, fighter aircraft were modified for the photo reconnaissance role because they had speed, although not great range. And a good example would be this airplane, originally a North American P-51D, modified into the North American F-6D photo recon platform. This airplane took photos like this, which look fairly benign to the untrained eye, but contain a tremendous amount of strategic and tactical information. Developed by Germany's Luftwaffe during World War II, the Arado AR-234 Blitz, or Lightning, was the world's first operational jet bomber. However, it was flown primarily for high-speed aerial reconnaissance, and in this capacity, it became the last Luftwaffe aircraft to overfly the United Kingdom during the war in April 1945. Other airplanes were modified into that role after the war, such as the Northrop YRB-49 Flying Wing or the Northrop F-15 Reporter. And I should mention F at this era stood for photo. This was an adaptation of Northrop's brilliant P-61 Black Widow. Then there were all new airplanes. The Hughes XF-11 was in a competition with the Republic XR-12 Rainbow for a highly coveted production contract for an all-new, high-speed, long-range photo recon transport. The XR-12 had a transport size or airliner size cabin with a full suite of cameras, and even a darkroom on board seen at the top of this photo where technicians could develop the photos in flight. In 1948, the Rainbow flew from Muroc Air Base in California to Mitchell Field on Long Island and set a cross-country record, flying in 7 hours coast to coast and taking a continuous strip photo of the United States, which had never been done before. Here's one of the last photos as it overflew New York almost 40,000 feet, preparing to descend into Mitchell Field on Long Island. Look at the detail in this, amazing. Well, after the war, those airplanes just came too late, and it was the beginning of the jet age, so neither entered production. But that role was adapted for existing aircraft, such as the Boeing RB-50, the Convair RB-36, and this is an interesting airplane. It's denoted from its bomber counterparts by radomes on the lower fuselage and antenna that you see there, and a pressurized capsule in the forward fuselage compartment that contained what were called ravens, which were airborne intercept operators gathering information in the airplane. For the Navy, the Martin P-4M Mercator was designed as a patrol aircraft. It was a hybrid piston-powered and jet-powered airplane. It was modified into the 1Q configuration for electronic intercept missions. The patrol role went to the Lockheed P-2V Neptune. However, P-2Vs were adapted by the Air Force, and 5 Lockheed RB-69s were used for airborne electronic intercept and photo recon. During the Cold War, ground stations around the globe monitored activities 24 hours a day, 7 days a week for the better part of 40 years and kept the world safe during the Cold War. But these land stations were augmented by airborne units. And here we see a crew on the Lockheed EC-121 Constellation for the Air Force and the Lockheed WV-2 Warning Star for the Navy. But now the ISR mission enters the jet age. And in Great Britain, the English Electric PR-9 Canberra was a good example. Beautiful airplane and a real pioneering effort in jet-powered photo recon. Ironically, it was adapted by the Air Force as the RB for photo recon and EB for electronic activities, and an airplane that was used for multiple missions in the early 1950s. But there's an ironic twist, and we're going to see this later in the program, what came of the Martin RB and EB-57. Other airplanes were modified, like this North American B-45 Tornado or the Boeing RB-47 Stratojet. And if you look at the midsection of the airplane in the foreground, you'll notice a bulge where the bomb bay is. And this is a container for a pressurized compartment of 3 Ravens on board the B-47. Well, what might have been? Let's take a look at some of the ideas and concepts that never came to be, but they were pretty exciting in their own right. The Avro 730 was intended to be a Mach 3 high-altitude recon platform, similar to what became the SR71 a decade later. This was a late 1950s airplane, and it was built out of stainless steel, or would have been built out of stainless steel, much like the Bristol 188, which was a stainless steel research aircraft. And in the Soviet Union, the Sukhoi T-4 was a high-altitude platform with a variable geometry nose seen here. None of these airplanes ever went into production or saw operational status. But aircraft that did were machines like this. The Ryan BQM-34 Firebee was intended originally as a high-speed jet-powered target drone. And this aircraft was adapted into the Model 147 Lightning Bug. Basically, the Firebee adapted with photo recon packages, and these were used to great effect during the war in Southeast Asia. About the same time period, the tagboard program came to be. This is nose art I painted on a B-52H at Edwards Air Force Base. And here's the airplane. It's a significant machine because this is the B-52H that launched the D-21 drones in the late 1960s. It was the Senior Bowl program, and this airplane is seen here with a Lockheed D-21B target drone. I'm sorry, photo recon drone. Had a little technical glitch there, I apologize. The Lockheed D-21B was launched from the B-52. It had an Avanti A-92 solid rocket booster to propel it to the speeds where the ramjet could kick in. Originally designed to be launched from the top of an SR-71 mothership, the D-21 was a ramjet-powered photo recon drone capable of overflying denied territory at Mach 3. After flying missions of nearly 3,000 miles in length, its camera and electronics package would be jettisoned at a drop point and retrieved in midair by an awaiting DC-130 Hercules recovery plane. Operational D-21 missions were flown from 1968 to 1971. Well, now we get into an interesting aspect of photo recon and spy plane missions, plowshares to swords, a take on the phrase, and we're going to talk about airliners and transports modified into these roles. What better example than one of the first great airliners, the Douglas DC-3, which became the C-47, used well into the 1970s as a VIP transport. But during the war in Southeast Asia, these airplanes were modified into the AC-47 Spooky gunship seen here, and a variant called the EC-47N, which became an airborne electronic intercept platform. Today, that role is performed by airplanes like the Beechcraft MC-12 Liberty, the MC-130 Combat Talon, the derivative of the C-130 Hercules, and of course, the Boeing KC-135 Stratotanker, a very significant airplane in this story. Why? Well, the passenger and cargo version, the Boeing C-135B Stratolifter, is the airframe that many ISR platforms were built upon. Here we see a fanjet-powered version, and here's the ultimate re-engined C-135 powered by CFM56 high bypass ratio turbofans. These airplanes had many missions, but among the most popular were the RC-135S Cobra Ball, which tracked missile launches, and the RC-135 Victor and Whiskey Rivet Joint programs, which were very high-performance, high-altitude intercept platforms. Now, this is the airliner version of the Boeing 707-320 Intercontinental, and this became the basis for airplanes like the AWACS and TACAMO for the Air Force and Navy, respectively, and the Boeing E-8C JSTAR, which stood for Joint Surveillance Target Attack Radar System. The Lockheed Electra first flew in 1958, entered passenger service in 1959. This was modified into the Lockheed P-3 Orion and the EP-3 electronic intercept aircraft seen here in model form. The beautiful de Havilland Comet 4 used the first jet to fly scheduled passenger service across the Atlantic in 1958 and adapted into several versions of the Nimrod, a maritime patrol aircraft, but also used very effectively for electronic intercept. The Boeing 737-800 series was modified into the Boeing P-8 Poseidon, an airplane that replaced the P-3 Orion. Even bizjets like this Bombardier Global Express or airplanes like the Gulfstream G5 were adapted into the ISR role. Here we see the Bombardier platform modified into the Raytheon Sentinel, an airplane used by the Royal Air Force until very recently. And now we get to the stars of the show, the dedicated mission aircraft. The Lockheed U2, originally conceived as an adaptation of the F-104 Starfighter to meet Air Force and CIA requirements for an all-new high-altitude recon jet that could fly high enough to evade ground-based anti-aircraft weapons. Created by designer Kelly Johnson's elite team at the Lockheed Skunk Works, the U-2 is one of very few military aircraft ever ordered back into production, not once, but twice during a 50-year period. It was first flown on August 8th, 1955, by famed Lockheed test pilot Tony LeVere. Here we see it in bare metal. And these U-2s from the Air Force Flight Test Center at Edwards Air Force Base show different color schemes during the early days of U-2 testing. The closer airplane is fitted with a satellite sensor turret behind the cockpit. These U-2s were powered by 12,000-pound thrust Pratt & Whitney J57 turbojets. Although a standard all-black color scheme was considered most effective for high-altitude camouflage, when U-2Cs were stationed in England in the 1970s, British authorities requested that they not be painted black, and this handsome two-tone blue camo was used. 6 early model U-2s were modified for in-flight refueling, and trivia buffs will recognize that aerial refueling boom as being on a piston-powered Boeing KC-97 tanker. That's quite a contrast in aeronautical eras. Serving as operational pilot trainers, two U-2Cs were modified with a second raised cockpit seen here, and these became U-2CTs. Pilots reported no appreciable difference in handling or performance compared to single-seat models. The constant addition of new ECM equipment and sensor packages took its toll on U-2 performance, resulting in a 50% reduction in range and 5,000-foot altitude penalty. Also, by 1966, more than 40 of the original 55 U-2 airframes built had been lost either to accidents or in-flight shootdowns over China, Cuba, and the Soviet Union. It was time for an entirely new and improved version to be designated the U-2R. Nearly 40% larger than the original airplane, the U-2R had a 23-foot larger wingspan and 30% more internal volume, coupled with a 2,900-gallon internal fuel capacity, giving it a ferry range of 8,000 miles. A new engine was obviously required for this improved U-2 variant, and the 17,000-pound thrust Pratt & Whitney J75 turbojet was selected. This is the same power plant used for Republic's F-105 Thunder Chief and Convair F-106 Delta Dart. A larger interchangeable nose section for more rapid sensor and camera package changes completed the modifications, and Lockheed test pilot Bill Park made the U-2R's inaugural flight from the CIA facility at Edwards North Base on August 28, 1967. By the late 1980s, the U-2R was yet again reaching its operational limits, and another engine upgrade was required for the final U-2 variant. General Electric's 20,000-pound thrust F-118 turbofan was selected, and this is the same power plant used for Northrop's B-2 Spirit stealth bomber. Additionally, the cockpit and flight instrumentation was brought up to modern digital age Air Force standards, and the first U-2S flew in 1989. This is the steam gauge cockpit of the earlier U-2s and compared to the digital cockpit of the U-2S. Eventually, all remaining U-2Rs were modified with the new engines and cockpits and are expected to serve in the ISR role for many more years to come. Here we see a unique configuration, the senior span. That's a radome affixed to the upper fuselage. These were used in the Bosnia campaign in January of 1998, and U-2Ss also served in Operation Iraqi Freedom. This stunning photo of a factory-fresh U-2S was taken from the open-air tail housing of a vintage World War II North American B-25 camera plane by noted Lockheed photographer Denny Lombard. Seen below the jet is the current home of the Lockheed Martin Skunk Works at Palmdale, California. What a beautiful photo. Now, you remember we talked about the Martin B-57, and perhaps the most dramatic example of aircraft modification is the original RB-57A into the Martin General Dynamics WB-57F. These 122-foot wingspan aircraft were powered by two Pratt & Whitney TF-33 turbofans plus two detachable 3,500-pound thrust Pratt & Whitney J60 turbojets mounted in pods that you can see attached to the wing outboard of the main engines. The auxiliary jets were air-started to increase the aircraft's maximum altitude to 60,000 feet. A total of 21 WB-57Fs were built, flying operational high-altitude strategic recon missions and weather research missions from 1963 to 1974. As of 2021, 3 of these aircraft were still flying with NASA. And now the ultimate airplane, the Lockheed Blackbird. Seen here, first prototype, the A-12, all-titanium airplane, Mach 3, 80,000-foot plus altitudes. First flown on April 30th, 1962 at Groom Lake, Nevada. The next variant was the YF-12, a Air Force interceptor version. It never went into operation, but it was an interesting idea to have a Mach 3 interceptor for the Cold War threat. The ultimate Blackbird, Lockheed's SR71A, as my friend Tony Landis calls it, Lockheed's Mach 3 masterpiece. First flown in December of 1964. Wait a minute, I have a better picture of the SR-71. Yeah, there we go. You didn't think I was going to do a video without a model box top, did you? As with the U2, two airframes were modified into the SR-71B pilot trainer. And let's talk about the Blackbird family. Flown from 1962 to 1999. There were 15 A-12 aircraft, 3 YF-12 aircraft, and 32 SR-71s for a grand total of 50 Blackbirds. Some were lost in accidents and in-flight issues, but the surviving Blackbirds all went to museums or were put in storage, and the SR has the distinction of not having one airplane ever scrapped. Then we look at today's ISR missions flown by the unmanned aircraft, such as the Northrop Grumman RQ-4 Global Hawk. But the U-2 will soldier on, and the combination of the unmanned assets and the U-2s will carry the ISR missions into the future. So is the sun setting on the manned ISR aircraft? That question remains to be seen, and we'll save that for another episode. So there you have it, a look at spy planes and all the different kinds of airplanes used for these missions in the 20th century and up to today. As always, special thanks to the wonderful folks and the great entities who make these episodes possible. And thank you so much for celebrating aviation with Mike Machat. I hope you enjoyed this presentation. If you haven't subscribed, we'd love to have you on board, and please hit the like button on the way out. That does help us with YouTube. As always, until next time, take care.